The smell of wilting lilies in the back of the limousine was more than just suffocating. It was the scent of a dying life, a scent that seemed to cling to the very pores of my skin. I sat there, draped in a black wool dress that felt like a shroud, staring out at the Atlanta skyline as it blurred into a gray smear of glass and steel. My name is Dahlia. I am 35 years old, and today I buried the only man in the King family who ever treated me like a human being. Solomon King was gone, and with him, the only buffer between me and the sharks I had called my family for 10 years. I felt a genuine sharp ache in my chest, a physical weight that made it hard to draw a full breath. In a family that worshipped at the altar of flash, status, and cold hard currency, Solomon had been the only one to speak to me about substance. He was the only one who saw the woman behind the teacher's daughter label his children had pinned on me like a badge of shame. I reached across the cold leather seat for my husband's hand. I needed comfort. I needed to feel the warmth of another person, to know I wasn't alone in this grief. But Marcus didn't move. His hand remained wrapped tightly around his phone, his thumb flicking rhythmically across the screen. He didn't even look up. He hadn't shed a single tear at the cemetery. While the dirt hit the casket, Marcus had been checking the stock market. He wasn't grieving the loss of a father. He was calculating the gains of a successor. $85 million, Dahlia. His voice finally broke the silence, but it wasn't a whisper of mourning. It was a giddy, breathless exclamation that felt like a slap in the face in the quiet of the car. 85 million. He said it again, tasting the numbers like they were vintage wine. I felt a shiver of revulsion. Marcus, please, I whispered, glancing nervously at the privacy glass that separated us from the driver. We just left the cemetery. Have some respect for his memory. He finally turned to look at me, and what I saw in his eyes froze the blood in my veins. They were bright, manic, and terrifyingly cold. There was no sadness there, no trace of the man I thought I had supported through his darkest years. He looked at me as if I were a stranger, or worse, a nuisance. What? Don't be dramatic, he snapped, waving a hand dismissively. You know what a tyrant he was. He kept me on a leash for 35 years. Now he's gone. I'm finally free. He let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed off the leather interior. God, I'm finally free. He didn't say we. The word we had vanished from his vocabulary the moment the heart monitor in Solomon's room had flatlined. He immediately began a feverish monologue about a Bentley, a convertible, British racing green, and a penthouse in Buckhead that overlooked the entire city. He spoke about our 2-bedroom apartment, the home where we had built a life for 5 years, as if it were a slum he had been forced to inhabit. It's embarrassing, he muttered, his lip curling in disgust. My head began to pound, a dull throb behind my eyes. I took a steadying breath, trying to ground him, trying to bring back the Marcus I knew. Marcus, that's wonderful, I said softly, but maybe we should focus on the essentials first. We're still not out of the woods from the debts. We owe so much. His face darkened instantly, the giddy excitement replaced by a sneer that made him look like a total stranger. Our debt? He spat. You mean your debt? My jaw dropped. I meant the $30,000 credit card bill I had just finished paying off for him the previous month. The bill he ran up during a business trip to Miami that yielded no business at all. I had used my entire year-end bonus from the foundation grant to cover his vanity. I mentioned this, my voice quiet but firm, reminding him that I had sacrificed my savings to keep us afloat. He scoffed, a sound I knew well. It was the sound of his ego protecting itself from the truth. Oh, your little writing job, he mocked, leaning in until his cologne, expensive and sharp, became overwhelming. All those little words you type for charity. You just don't get it, do you? Your little bonus is pocket change. It's a rounding error. He reached out and grabbed my chin, his fingers digging into my skin with a pressure that wasn't quite violent, but was deeply controlling. I'm the one with the money now, Dahlia. I am the one who matters. You don't need to worry your pretty little head about your career anymore. In fact, I'd rather you didn't work at all. It's beneath us now. You're a king's wife, not some charity worker. The ride ended at our apartment building. the building I had leased 5 years ago when he was unemployed and at his lowest. I was the one who had signed the papers. I was the one who had paid the rent every single month, while Marcus found himself between failed business ideas and luxury hobbies. He didn't help me with the car door. He didn't offer a hand. He strode into the lobby with a new posture, his shoulders back, his chest out. He wasn't the struggling husband I had left with this morning. He was a king in his own mind. I followed him up, feeling a sense of dread that I couldn't explain. The elevator ride was silent and heavy. I just wanted to take off the black dress, wash the scent of lilies away, and sleep for a week. But as we entered the apartment, Marcus walked straight to the bedroom. I heard the closet doors fly open. I heard the distinct, sharp thud of my suitcase being thrown onto the bed. When I reached the doorway, I saw him pulling my clothes from their hangers in clumps, stuffing them haphazardly into the bag. "What are you doing?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. He turned, his face a mask of cold indifference. "I'm helping you pack, Dahlia. Get your things." My stomach turned to ice. "What are you talking about? You're scaring me, Marcus. Stop this." He laughed. It was a loud, cruel sound that shattered the last of my illusions. "Scaring you? No, Dahlia. I'm liberating you." He zipped the suitcase shut and rolled it into the living room. "This is my apartment, Marcus!" I yelled, my voice finally finding its strength. "My name is on the lease!" He turned on me then, his eyes narrowing into slits. "And my name is on an $85 million inheritance. I'm tired of this apartment. I'm tired of this neighborhood. And I am sick to death of you." I couldn't breathe. It felt like the oxygen had been sucked out of the room. You're leaving me?" I stammered. He walked to the kitchen counter, picked up my purse, and headed for the front door. "No, Dahlia," he said, opening the door wide to the hallway. "I'm not leaving. You are." "I've been waiting years to do this," he continued, his voice casual, as if he were discussing the weather. "Years of pretending to care about your boring job, your boring friends, and your pathetic, responsible life. Years of being stuck with a woman like you, while I waited for the old man to finally die." I stood there, trembling. "I supported you," I whispered. "When you lost your job, when you were depressed, I paid for everything. I believed in you." He smiled, and it was the most terrifying thing I had ever seen. "That was your mistake," he said. "You were just a placeholder, Dahlia. A convenient, naive, worthless woman." He threw my purse into the hallway, and then he threw my suitcase after it. "My lawyer will call you tomorrow. You'll get nothing. You aren't entitled to a dime of my family's money." He slammed the door, and the sound of the deadbolt sliding into place was the loudest sound I had ever heard. I was standing in the hall, homeless, in a funeral dress, while my husband celebrated his father's death inside. But what Marcus forgot was that the will hadn't been read yet, and Solomon King always had a plan. I stood in that hallway for what felt like hours, the cold air from the building's ventilation system biting at my bare arms. The brass number 3B on the door blurred as my eyes finally filled with tears I couldn't hold back. Just an hour ago, I was mourning a father figure. Now I was mourning a decade of my life. Every sacrifice I had made, every extra shift I had worked at the foundation to cover Marcus's investment opportunities, every time I had defended his ego against his father's sharp tongue, it all felt like ash in my mouth. I reached out, my fingers trembling, and touched the wood of the door. I wanted to scream, to pound on the door until my knuckles bled, to demand an explanation for how a human being could be this cruel. But the silence from inside was louder than any scream. I could hear the faint, muffled sound of a cork popping. He wasn't just moving on, he was pouring a drink. The ding of the elevator echoed through the corridor, a sharp, mechanical intrusion on my misery. The doors slid open, and Chloe King stepped out. She looked less like a woman who had just buried her father, and more like a woman who had just won the lottery. She was wearing a chic, cream-colored power suit, a deliberate, jarring contrast to the sea of black at the cemetery. She saw me immediately. She saw the suitcase lying slumped against the wall like a dead body. She saw my tear-streaked face and the way I was clutching my purse to my chest. And she smiled. It wasn't a smile of surprise. It was a smile of pure, unadulterated satisfaction, the kind of look a predator gives a cornered animal. "Oh, good," she said, her voice dripping with a honeyed malice that made my skin crawl. "He finally did it. I thought he might lose his nerve, but I suppose $85 million is a wonderful motivator for clarity." She walked toward me, the clicking of her designer heels sounding like a countdown. She didn't offer a tissue. She didn't ask if I had a place to go. She simply moved past me, as if I were a piece of discarded furniture left out for the morning trash. "Marcus, it's me," she called out, knocking rhythmically on the door. "Open up! We have reservations at 7 Lamps, and I refuse to be late for the celebration of the century." The door I had been locked out of opened instantly. Marcus stood there, his tie already loosened, a glass of amber liquid in his hand. He didn't even glance at me as he pulled his sister into a hug. "It's done," he told her, his voice booming with a newfound authority. Chloe looked back at me over his shoulder, her eyes full of a pitying contempt that hurt worse than Marcus's anger. "Listen, Dahlia," she said, her tone conversational, as if she were giving me fashion advice. "Don't make this ugly. You and Marcus, you're just from 2 different worlds. You were a nice little diversion, a placeholder while he was waiting for his real life to start. But now the adults are talking, and the real life has begun. You don't belong with the King family. You never did. You were just the help that didn't get a paycheck." The door slammed shut again, the double locks clicking into place like the closing of a tomb. 2 different worlds. The words echoed in my head, dragging me back to our wedding day. I remembered Chloe standing in the back of the garden, whispering to her cousins about how my parents were just teachers, and how my dress probably came from a rack at a department store. I had ignored it then, believing that love was the great equalizer. I had been so naive. But as I stood there, humiliated and broken, a different memory surfaced, one that wasn't shrouded in pain. It was a memory of 2 weeks ago, in Solomon's bedroom. The room had smelled of old paper and the sharp tang of antiseptic. Solomon had been propped up on his pillows, his skin like parchment, his breath a shallow rattle. Marcus and Chloe had been downstairs in the kitchen, their voices rising in a heated argument over who would inherit the beach house in Hilton Head. They hadn't even waited for him to close his eyes before they started carving up his corpse. Solomon had looked at me, his eyes, usually so stern, softening with a strange, lucid intensity. He had waved me closer, his hand trembling as he reached for mine. "Dahlia," he had whispered, his voice a dry rasp. I had leaned in, thinking he wanted water. "Yes, Solomon, I'm right here." He had gripped my hand with a strength that surprised me. "My children," he said, shaking his head slowly. "They are a disappointment. All shine and no substance, all flash and no fire. They think they know the value of things, but they don't know the value of people." He coughed, a painful hacking sound that shook his frail frame. "But you have integrity. You are the only one in this house who is truly a king." I had tried to shush him, telling him he needed to rest, but he wouldn't let go. "I know my son, Dahlia. I know what he will do when the money is in sight. Remember this. The official will reading is 6 days away. Not today, not tomorrow. 6 days. Don't let them break you before then." At the time, I thought it was just the rambling of a dying man gripped by fever. I thought he was just being bitter about his children's greed. But standing in the hallway, watching the elevator numbers count down as I prepared to leave my own home, those words felt like a lifeline. 6 days. Marcus thought he was already a king, but he was celebrating a victory in a war that hadn't officially ended. He believed the money was already in his account, that the $85 million was a foregone conclusion based on a preliminary draft he'd sneaked a peek at months ago. But Solomon was a man of secrets, a man who built an empire on the things people didn't see coming. I picked up my suitcase, the weight of it straining my shoulder. I didn't have a car. Marcus had taken the keys to the SUV we shared, claiming it was family property. I walked out of the building and into the humid Atlanta night. I didn't cry anymore. The shock had transitioned into a cold, hard knot of resolve. I went to a small, dingy motel 3 blocks away, a place Marcus wouldn't be caught dead in. I checked in under my maiden name. As I sat on the edge of the scratchy floral bedspread, looking at my reflection in the cracked vanity mirror, I realized I had 2 choices. I could crawl away and disappear, or I could wait for those 6 days to pass. I pulled my laptop from my bag. My little writing job, as Marcus called it, had given me one thing he didn't have: a network of people who actually liked me for who I was. I began to type. I needed to find Solomon's lawyer, a man named Elias Thorne. Elias was the only person Solomon trusted, a man as silent and observant as a gargoyle. If there was a twist in this story, Elias would be the one holding the script. I spent the night researching, my mind racing. By dawn, I realized something. Marcus hadn't just thrown me out, he had committed a legal error. The apartment was in my name. The bank accounts he had drained were joint. He was acting with the impunity of a man who thought he was untouchable, but he was leaving a trail of wreckage that I could use. As the sun began to rise over the city, I felt a shift in my spirit. The Dahlia who had been a placeholder died in that hallway. The woman sitting in this motel room was someone else. I remembered Solomon's final look, the way he had smirked when he mentioned the will. He wasn't just leaving money, he was setting a trap. And Marcus, in his greed, had walked right into it. I had 5 days left to prepare for the reading of the will. 5 days to stay quiet while Marcus and Chloe spent money they didn't technically have yet. I took a deep breath, the air in the motel room smelling of stale smoke and old carpet, and for the first time since the funeral, I smiled. The morning sun didn't bring warmth. It brought a cold, clinical clarity. I woke up on that thin motel mattress with my joints aching and my heart feeling like a hollowed-out shell. My first instinct was to check my phone, to see if Marcus had called, if he had woken up and realized the monstrous mistake he'd made. But there were no missed calls. There were no "I'm sorry" texts. Instead, my social media feed was already a battlefield of his arrogance. Chloe had posted a photo of the 2 of them at 7 Lamps, clinking crystal flutes of champagne. The caption read, "To new beginnings and shedding the dead weight, finally back where we belong." I looked at Marcus in the photo. He looked younger. He looked triumphant. He looked like a man who had successfully performed a surgical extraction, removing me from his life as if I were a malignant tumor. I put the phone down, my hands trembling. I couldn't afford to be the weeping wife anymore. I had exactly 5 days until the official will reading at the King estate. If I was going to survive this, I needed to stop acting like a victim and start acting like the woman Solomon King thought I was. He had called me a king in that hospital bed. It was time to find out why. I spent the morning in that cramped motel room, using the slow, stuttering Wi-Fi to track down Elias Thorne. Elias wasn't just any lawyer. He was a legend in the South, a man known for handling the old money of families who preferred their secrets buried deeper than their ancestors. When I finally got his assistant on the line, my voice cracked. "I'm Dahlia King," I said, bracing for a cold rejection. "I'd like to speak with Mr. Thorne." There was a pause, a brief moment of silence that made my heart hammer against my ribs. "Mrs. King," the assistant said, her tone shifting from professional to almost empathetic. "Mr. Thorne has been expecting your call. Can you be at his office at 2 o'clock? Expecting me? The words hung in the air. Solomon had truly seen this coming. He knew his son better than I ever did. I spent my last few dollars on a ride to the financial district. I walked into the mahogany-lined offices of Thorne and Associates feeling like an intruder. I was still wearing the black dress from the funeral, now wrinkled and smelling of the motel's cleaning supplies. I felt small, insignificant, and utterly out of place among the marble statues and the silent, high-priced clerks. But when Elias Thorne walked out to meet me, he didn't look at my wrinkled clothes. He looked straight into my eyes with a gaze that felt like it was searching for a specific spark. He was a tall, silver-haired man who moved with the deliberate grace of a predator. He led me into a private office that overlooked the city, a room filled with the scent of expensive tobacco and leather-bound law books. He didn't offer me tea or platitudes. He sat down behind a desk that looked like it belonged to a judge and folded his hands. "He's thrown you out, hasn't he?" Elias asked. It wasn't a question, it was a confirmation. I nodded, the lump in my throat preventing me from speaking. Elias sighed, a sound of weary disappointment. Solomon predicted it would happen within 48 hours of the interment. Marcus was always a predictable boy, greedy, impatient, and remarkably short-sighted. He opened a thick manila folder on his desk. I suppose he told you he's inheriting $85 million. I nodded again. That's the figure he saw in a draft 3 years ago, Elias said, a faint, dry smile touching his lips. Solomon allowed him to see it. He wanted to see what Marcus would do with that information. He wanted to see if his son would use that supposed future wealth to build something, or if he would simply wait for his father to die so he could spend it. I leaned forward, my breath hitching. "And?" I whispered. Elias leaned back, the leather of his chair creaking. Solomon changed his will 4 times in the last year, Dahlia. The final version was signed and notarized 2 days before he passed away. Only I have seen it. Not even the executors know the full scope of the changes. He paused, his sharp eyes pinning me to my seat. Tell me, Dahlia, why did you stay with him? Even when he was failing? Even when he was cruel? I thought about the question. I thought about the late nights I'd spent helping Marcus rewrite business plans that I knew were flawed. I thought about the way I'd hidden my own successes so he wouldn't feel diminished. Because I believed in the man I thought he could be, I said, my voice finally steady. And because Solomon asked me to. He told me once that Marcus was a broken compass, and he hoped I could be the North Star. I took that seriously. I loved the family, Elias, not the money. The family. Elias nodded slowly, as if checking off a box in his mind. Good, because the next 5 days are going to be very difficult for you. Marcus has already begun pre-spending his inheritance. He's taken out massive bridge loans based on his status as the primary heir. He's purchased a penthouse, a fleet of cars, and he's currently hosting a week-long celebration of life that is nothing more than a vulgar display of wealth. He thinks he's untouchable. He thinks you are nothing. He reached into the folder and pulled out a small sealed envelope. It was heavy, the paper high-quality vellum. On the front, in Solomon's unmistakable, shaky handwriting, was my name. Solomon left this for you. He told me to give it to you only if Marcus did exactly what he did. If Marcus had been a grieving son, if he had treated you with respect, this envelope was to be destroyed. But Marcus chose his path. I took the envelope, my fingers brushing the cool paper. I felt a sudden, overwhelming surge of grief for the old man. Even in his final moments, he was playing chess with the lives of those he left behind, trying to ensure that some form of justice survived him. What's in here? I asked. Instructions, Elias said, and a choice. You can open it now and see what Solomon has planned, or you can wait until the reading. But I should warn you, Dahlia, if you follow Solomon's lead, there is no going back. You will no longer be the quiet, supportive wife. You will be the storm that levels the King household. Are you ready for that? Are you ready to stop being the victim and start being the beneficiary? I looked at the envelope, then out at the skyline where Marcus was likely at this very moment, spending money that wasn't his, laughing at the memory of my face when he locked the door. I thought about the 10 years of my life I had poured into a black hole of his ego. I looked back at Elias and felt a cold, hard flame ignite in my chest. I didn't open the envelope yet. I tucked it safely into my purse. I've been the North Star for 10 years, Elias, I said, my voice ringing with a strength I didn't know I possessed. I think it's time I became the storm. Elias smiled, a real, genuine smile this time. I'll see you in 5 days at the estate, Mrs. King. And Dahlia, don't buy a new dress. Wear the black one. Remind them exactly who was there when the light went out. I walked out of that office not as a homeless woman, but as a woman with a secret. I had no money in my pocket, but I had the ghost of Solomon King at my back. As I stepped back onto the sidewalk, I saw a green Bentley Continental roar past, Marcus at the wheel, his sister Chloe laughing in the passenger seat. They didn't see me. They didn't even look. They were too busy looking at the palace they thought they'd won. They had no idea the foundations were already crumbling. The 4 days that followed were a surreal descent into a world of glitz, glamour, and absolute moral bankruptcy. While I moved into a slightly better, though still modest, long-term stay hotel using a small emergency fund, Solomon had slipped into my hand months before his death. Marcus was busy making sure the entire city of Atlanta knew he was the new king. I spent my hours in a quiet corner of the public library, my laptop open, watching the digital footprint of my own destruction. Marcus and Chloe weren't just spending money. They were performing an exorcism. Every photo they posted, every story they shared on social media, was a deliberate attempt to erase the 10 years I had spent building a life with him. I watched through a burner account as they hosted a legacy gala at the very penthouse Marcus had mentioned in the car. The images were nauseating. There was Marcus, dressed in a tuxedo that probably cost more than my entire college education, holding a crystal glass and laughing with developers and socialites who wouldn't have looked at him twice a week ago. Chloe was by his side, draped in gold, playing the role of the Queen Mother. They were surrounded by people Solomon had despised, yes men, fair-weather friends, and predatory investors looking to get a piece of the $85 million pie. But I noticed something Marcus didn't. In the background of one of the photos, I saw a group of men in sharp charcoal gray suits. They weren't laughing. They were observing. They were the lenders, the men who had provided the bridge loans Elias Thorne had mentioned. Marcus was treating those loans like won money, but these men were treating them like bait. He was mortgaging a future that hadn't been signed over to him yet. He was building a house of cards on a foundation of sand, and he was doing it with a smile that made my stomach churn. On the third day, I finally opened the envelope Solomon had left me. I sat on the edge of my bed, the city lights flickering outside my window, and broke the heavy wax seal. Inside was a single, handwritten letter and a small, antique iron key. The letter didn't start with "Dear Dahlia." It started with a command. "Read this twice, then burn it," it said. Solomon's voice leaped off the page, stern, calculated, and unexpectedly tender. "Dahlia," the letter began, "if you are reading this, then my son has proven himself to be the man I feared he was, and you have proven to be the woman I hoped you were. To love a king is to be a martyr, but I never intended for you to be a victim. Marcus thinks wealth is a destination. He thinks $85 million is a shield that will protect him from his own incompetence. He is wrong. Wealth is a tool, and in the hands of a fool, it is a weapon that only points inward." The letter went on to detail a secret Solomon had kept from everyone, including Elias Thorne. He described a private vault in the basement of the old King estate, the one the iron key belonged to. Inside that vault wasn't more money, it was evidence. Solomon had been tracking Marcus's business dealings for years. He knew about the offshore accounts Marcus had tried to set up to hide money from me. He knew about the contracts Marcus had forged using Solomon's signature while the old man was drugged on pain medication in his final weeks. Marcus hadn't just been waiting for his father to die. He had been actively trying to accelerate his own inheritance through fraud. "He thinks he is inheriting a fortune," Solomon wrote, "but he is actually inheriting a debt to justice. The will reading in 2 days is not a coronation, Dahlia. It is a trial. I have structured my estate so that the bulk of the liquid assets are tied to a morality clause, a clause Marcus will find impossible to satisfy once the contents of that vault are revealed. You are the only one who can open it. You are the only one I trust to decide whether to show mercy or to let the hammer fall. Choose wisely, my daughter, not for me, but for yourself." I stared at the iron key. It was cold and heavy in my palm. Solomon wasn't just giving me a way to get back at Marcus, he was giving me the power to destroy him. If I opened that vault and brought those documents to the will reading, Marcus wouldn't just be broke. He would be in orange coveralls. He would lose the penthouse, the Bentley, the new friends, and his freedom. I felt a rush of power so intoxicating it made my head light. For 10 years, I had been the worthless woman. For 10 years, I had been the one who didn't matter. Now, I held the kill switch for the entire King dynasty. But as the night wore on, the weight of the choice began to press down on me. I thought about the Marcus I had married, the man who used to make me coffee in the morning and tell me my stories were important. Was that man ever real? Or was he just a mask he wore until he didn't need it anymore?
I looked at the photos of him at the gala again. He looked so happy. He looked so sure of himself. He had no idea that I was sitting in a $10 a night motel holding his life in my hands. The fourth day was the hardest. I stayed in my room, the iron key burning a hole in my pocket. I received a text from an unknown number. It was a video. I pressed play and saw Marcus and Chloe standing on the balcony of the new penthouse. Marcus was holding a bottle of champagne over the edge, pouring it down onto the street below. "To the peasants!" he shouted, his voice thick with drink. "To the Dahlias of the world! May you always stay exactly where you belong, at the bottom!" He laughed, and Chloe joined in, her high-pitched cackle echoing through the speakers of my phone. That was the moment the last shred of hesitation vanished. I had spent years trying to save Marcus from himself, thinking that if I just loved him enough, if I just supported him enough, he would become the man Solomon wanted him to be. I realized now that I wasn't his North Star. I was his enabler. By protecting him from the consequences of his actions, I had allowed him to become a monster. Solomon hadn't given me this key to be cruel. He had given it to me to be just. I called Elias Thorne. "I'm ready," I said, my voice like flint. "Tell me what I need to do for the reading tomorrow." Elias sounded almost relieved. "The car will pick you up at 9 a.m., Dahlia. The family will be gathered in the library of the main estate. Marcus has invited his new investors to witness his triumph. He's turned the reading into a press event. He wants the world to see him officially become a king. Then let him have his audience," I replied. "I'll be there. And Elias, make sure there's a shredder in the room. I want him to see exactly what happens to a house of cards when the wind finally blows." I hung up and looked at the black dress hanging on the back of the door. I spent the rest of the evening meticulously ironing it. I didn't want to look like a victim. I wanted to look like an executioner. As I laid down to sleep, the iron key tucked under my pillow, I felt a strange sense of peace. The official will reading was less than 12 hours away. Marcus thought he was going to collect a check for $85 million. He had no idea he was actually walking into a trap that had been 10 years in the making. The morning of the will reading arrived with a heavy gray sky that seemed to press down on the city of Atlanta like a lid. I woke up before the sun, my mind already sharp and humming with a cold electric energy. I didn't feel like the woman who had been thrown out into the hallway 6 days ago. That woman had been defined by her grief and her loyalty to a ghost. The woman standing in front of the motel mirror today was defined by her mission. I put on the black wool dress. I brushed my hair until it shone like crow's wings. I didn't wear jewelry except for a simple silver watch Solomon had given me for my 30th birthday. I didn't need diamonds to show my worth. I had the iron key tucked into the hidden pocket of my dress, and that was more valuable than everything Marcus thought he owned. When the black sedan sent by Elias Thorne pulled up to the motel, the driver's eyes widened slightly. He had likely expected a broken woman, someone he'd have to help into the back seat. Instead, I opened my own door and sat with a posture so straight it felt like my spine was made of steel. We drove in silence toward the King Estate, a sprawling, colonial-style mansion tucked behind iron gates and ancient oaks dripping with Spanish moss. As we turned into the long driveway, I saw the circus Marcus had created. There were cars everywhere, Ferraris, Lamborghinis, and the unmistakable British racing green Bentley Marcus had bragged about. He had actually done it. He had invited the city's elite, his new friends, and even a few members of the local business press to witness his ascent. He wanted his coronation to be public. He wanted the world to see that he was finally the man his father never thought he could be. I felt a flicker of pity for him then, a brief, passing shadow of the love I once felt. He was so desperate for approval that he was willing to perform his life on a stage built of borrowed money. I stepped out of the car, and the humidity hit me like a physical wall. The scent of blooming jasmine was thick, almost cloying. As I walked toward the front steps, the crowd of socialites and investors parted. I heard the whispers. "Is that her?" "That's the wife he kicked out." "She looks different." I didn't look at them. I kept my eyes fixed on the heavy mahogany front doors. I could hear Marcus's voice booming from the library, a sound of unearned confidence and shallow laughter. When I entered the library, the room went silent. It was a massive space, 2 stories tall, lined with thousands of leather-bound books that Solomon had actually read. Marcus was standing by the fireplace, a glass of scotch in one hand, gesturing wildly to a group of men in expensive suits. Chloe was beside him, draped in a silk dress, the color of fresh blood. When Marcus saw me, his smile didn't falter. It sharpened. It became a weapon of ridicule. "Well, well," Marcus announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "The ghost returns. I didn't think you'd have the nerve to show your face here, Dahlia. But I suppose you're here for the crumbs? Looking for a final handout before you head back to the classroom?" A few of his new friends chuckled, a dry, sycophantic sound. Marcus walked toward me, his gait slightly unsteady from the morning's drinking. "You're late, but don't worry, we haven't gotten to the good part yet. You can sit in the back. Just try not to get tears on the rug. It's an antique." I didn't say a word. I simply walked past him, my heels clicking rhythmically on the hardwood, and took a seat in the very front row, directly across from the desk where Elias Thorne was currently setting up his briefcase. Elias looked up, his gray eyes meeting mine. He gave a single, almost imperceptible nod. He saw the iron keys outline in my pocket. He knew the storm was here. Chloe stepped forward, her eyes narrowing as she looked at my black dress. "You really are committed to the morning act, aren't you, Dahlia? It's a bit much. Father's been gone for a week. The sun is out, the money is flowing, and honestly, that dress is so last season." She leaned in, her voice a poisonous whisper meant only for me. "Enjoy the show, darling, because once Elias finishes reading those papers, you'll be escorted off this property by security. I've already called them." I looked up at her, and for the first time in 10 years, I didn't feel intimidated by her. I felt sorry for her. "The sun is out, Chloe," I said softly, my voice calm and steady. "But I think you'll find the forecast is about to change." Marcus clapped his hands together, signaling for everyone to take their seats. He sat in Solomon's old leather wingback chair, sprawling his legs out as if he were already the master of the house. "All right, Elias," Marcus barked, waving his glass toward the lawyer. "Let's get this over with. We have a flight to Vegas at 4, and I'd like to have the wire transfers initiated before we take off. Read the numbers. Skip the legal jargon. We all know why we're here." Elias Thorne stood up. He didn't look at Marcus. He looked at the room, his presence commanding an immediate heavy silence. He opened the final will and testament of Solomon King. "This document," Elias began, his voice echoing in the high-ceilinged room, "was executed 48 hours prior to the passing of Solomon King. It supersedes all previous drafts, all verbal promises, and all informal agreements." Marcus smirked, leaning back and winking at one of his investors. He was so sure. He was so certain that the world was about to give him everything he wanted. "To my daughter, Chloe King," Elias read, "I leave the property in Hilton Head and a trust fund of $5 million, provided she completes a mandatory 3-year course in financial management. Should she fail to attend, the assets will revert to the King Foundation." Chloe gasped, her face flushing a deep, angry red. $5 million? That's it? The beach house is worth that alone. This is a joke. "Quiet, Chloe," Marcus hissed, though his own face was beginning to pale. "He's just getting to the main estate. Keep your eyes on the prize." Elias cleared his throat and continued. "To my son, Marcus King, I leave the sum of $85 million. The room erupted in a low murmur of awe. Marcus let out a triumphant, "Yes," and stood up, raising his glass to the crowd. He looked at me, his eyes burning with a cruel, mocking light. "Hear that, Dahlia? 85 million. Now who's worthless?" "However," Elias interrupted, his voice cutting through Marcus's celebration like a blade, "the distribution of these funds is subject to the King Integrity Clause. Under the terms of this clause, Marcus King must demonstrate that he has acted with honor, honesty, and marital fidelity during the period of probate. Furthermore, The will stipulates that before a single cent is transferred, a full audit of all personal and business activities conducted in the 60 days prior to my death must be completed. Marcus's glass stopped halfway to his lips. What? What kind of audit? He was my father. He didn't have the right to— He had every right, Marcus, Elias said coldly. And there is one more thing. Solomon King left a final contingency. He stated that if there was any evidence of fraud, any attempt to circumvent the law, or any act of cruelty toward his family members, the $85 million would be forfeited in its entirety. Marcus started to laugh, but it was a thin, brittle sound. Evidence? What evidence? The old man was bedridden. He didn't know anything. You can't prove a thing. I stood up then. The movement was slow, deliberate. Every eye in the room turned to me. I reached into my pocket and pulled out the antique iron key. I held it up so the light from the chandelier caught its jagged edges. Marcus's face went from pale to a ghostly, sickly white. He knew that key. He had spent years looking for the vault it opened, thinking his father had hidden gold or jewels inside. "The vault in the basement, Marcus," I said, my voice ringing out with a clarity that surprised even me. "The one you couldn't find. Solomon gave me the key. He gave me the evidence you say doesn't exist. He knew about the offshore accounts. He knew about the forged signatures. And he knew exactly how you would treat me the moment he was gone." The silence in the room was now absolute. It was the silence of a tomb. Marcus looked at the key, then at me. And for the first time in his life, I saw true, unadulterated terror in his eyes. He realized then that he wasn't the king. He was just the fool who had been allowed to play on the throne while the real power waited in the shadows. The library, which only moments ago had been filled with the arrogant energy of a victory party, was now a vacuum of bated breath. Marcus's hand, still clutching the expensive scotch, began to shake so violently that the ice cubes rattled against the glass like a frantic heartbeat. The investors in the back of the room were shifting in their seats, their eyes darting toward the exits. They were sharks. They could smell blood in the water, and for the first time, the blood wasn't mine. It was his. "That key doesn't mean anything!" Marcus roared, his voice cracking as he tried to reclaim his dominance. "It's a prop, a desperate play from a woman who's about to be a nobody. Elias, tell her. Tell her she has no standing here." Elias Thorne didn't even look up from his papers. "On the contrary, Marcus, the will specifically names Dahlia King as the keeper of the record. If she possesses the key to the Solomon vault, she has the legal authority and the obligation to present its contents before the final.
Distribution of assets can be ratified. If you interfere, you are in immediate breach of the integrity clause." I didn't wait for Marcus to find another insult. I turned and walked toward the heavy oak door that led to the basement stairs. I could feel him following me, his heavy, frantic footsteps echoing mine. Chloe was right behind him, her silk dress rustling with an agitated, nervous sound. The rest of the guests stayed in the library, frozen in a state of morbid curiosity. But the air in the house had shifted. The celebration was over. The autopsy had begun. The stairs to the basement were narrow and steep, carved from the same ancient stone as the foundation of the house. It was cold down here, the air smelling of damp earth and the heavy metallic scent of iron. We reached a reinforced steel door at the far end of the wine cellar, a door Marcus had tried to break into dozens of times over the years, leaving pry marks and scratches that now served as a testament to his greed. He stood behind me, his breath hot on the back of my neck. "Dahlia, think about what you're doing," he hissed, his tone shifting from aggression to a desperate, oily persuasion. "If there's something in there that hurts me, it hurts the family name. It hurts us. We can talk about this. I'll give you $1 million. No, $5 million. We'll go back to the penthouse. We'll forget the last week ever happened. Just give me the key." I stopped and turned to look at him. Up close, in the dim light of the basement, he looked small. He looked like the man I had married, a man who was always looking for a shortcut, always waiting for someone else to pay the price for his mistakes. "There is no us, Marcus," I said, my voice as cold as the stone floor beneath us. "You killed us the moment you threw my life into a hallway like it was garbage. You didn't just throw me out, You threw away the only person who actually cared about your soul. Now, you're just left with your creditors. I inserted the iron key into the lock. It turned with a heavy, satisfying clunk that felt like a gavel hitting a block. The door swung open on silent, well-oiled hinges. Marcus pushed past me, expecting to see piles of gold or stacks of bonds. But the room was small, stark, and clinical. There were no riches here. Instead, the walls were lined with filing cabinets and a single high-definition monitor mounted on the wall. In the center of the room was a small pedestal with a single manila envelope and a digital tablet. Marcus lunged for the envelope, but Elias, who had followed us down, stepped in his way with a surprising amount of strength. "Don't, Marcus. Everything in this room is being recorded and live-streamed to the estate's legal servers. If you touch anything without authorization, it's a felony." I walked to the pedestal. My heart was pounding, but my hand was steady. I picked up the tablet. A video file was already queued up. I pressed play. Solomon's face filled the screen. He looked tired, but his eyes were like flint. He was sitting in his study, the very room we had just left. "Marcus," the recording began, and the sound of his father's voice made Marcus jump as if he'd been struck. "If you are watching this, it means you have failed. It means you chose the gold over the girl. It means you thought your cleverness could outrun your character." The video cut to a series of documents, bank statements from a bank in the Cayman Islands, contracts with Marcus's forged signature, and private investigator photos of Marcus meeting with a rival developer to sell off Solomon's land behind his back. "I knew about the Miami business trips, Marcus," Solomon's voice continued, a deep tone of disappointment echoing through the small room. "I knew you were using Dahlia's hard-earned money to fund a lifestyle you hadn't earned. I watched you belittle the woman who was the only thing keeping you from the gutter, and I decided that if you couldn't be a man of substance, you would at least be a man of consequences." The screen flashed a final image, a legal document titled The Final Codicil. "Dahlia," Solomon said, his image returning to the screen. He looked directly into the camera, and for a moment, it felt like he was right there in the room with us. "The $85 million exists, but it is not a gift. It is a trust, and the trustee is not Marcus. It's you." The room went deathly silent. Chloe let out a strangled cry. Marcus looked like he was about to faint. "The money is to be managed by Dahlia King," the recording finished. "She will decide Marcus's allowance. She will decide if he has earned his place in this family. She will decide if the King name continues or if it ends with him. Marcus, you wanted to be a king. Now you'll have to learn how to be a subject." The screen went black. I looked at Marcus. He was leaning against the cold stone wall, his face a mask of pure, unadulterated horror. He wasn't the billionaire he thought he was. He was a man whose entire existence now depended on the mercy of the woman he had called worthless just 6 days ago. "Dahlia," he whispered, his voice trembling. "Dahlia, honey, you know I didn't mean those things. I was just stressed. The grief, it made me crazy. You know I love you." He took a step toward me, his hands reaching out, but I didn't move. I didn't feel anger anymore. I didn't even feel the need for revenge. I just felt a profound sense of relief. The weight of the last 10 years was gone. "Elias," I said, my voice calm and professional, "please escort the guests out. The party is over. And Marcus? You should probably call your lawyer, the one you said would call me. You're going to need him. Because the audit starts tomorrow morning, and according to Solomon's records, you owe the estate approximately $4 million in unauthorized withdrawals. I expect that paid back by the end of the week." I walked out of the vault, leaving Marcus and Chloe standing in the cold, dark basement. As I climbed the stairs back into the light, I felt the iron key in my hand. It was no longer a weapon. It was the key to my own future. A future where I was finally the one in control. The library was no longer a palace of triumph. It had become a hall of judgment. As I walked back up from the basement, the guests were already scurrying toward the exits, their faces averted. They were the vultures of the high society world, and they knew when the carcass they had come to feast upon was actually a trap. The investors Marcus had bragged to were huddled in a corner, their hushed voices sharp with panic. They hadn't just invested in Marcus. They had gambled on his inheritance, and the house had just flipped the table. I stood by the large mahogany desk as Elias Thorne began the process of sealing the room. Marcus and Chloe stumbled up the stairs a few moments later, looking as though they had seen a ghost. Marcus's face was no longer the mask of a billionaire. It was the face of a man who had just realized the ground beneath him was nothing but smoke. He didn't look at the crowd. He didn't look at his sister. He looked at me, and for the first time in our marriage, there was a raw, naked fear in his eyes that made him look like a total stranger. "Dahlia, wait," he said, his voice a frantic, low-pitched plea. He tried to grab my arm, but I stepped back, the movement so fluid and natural it was as if a physical barrier now existed between us. "You can't do this. My father was old. He was out of his mind. That video, it's not legal. You can't control my life. We're married. Everything I have is yours, and everything you have is mine." I looked at him, and for the first time, I didn't feel the urge to soften my expression. "We were married, Marcus," I said, my voice steady enough to cut glass. "Until you threw me out. Until you told me I was a placeholder. Until you decided that your father's death was a payday rather than a loss. And as for what's ours, you're right. The debt you've run up in the last 6 days is technically ours. But the 85 million? That belongs to the King Trust, and the trust has a very specific manager." Chloe stepped forward, her silk dress now looking crumpled and cheap in the harsh light of the afternoon. "This is a setup. You manipulated him. You spent all those nights sitting with my father, whispering in his ear, poisoning him against his own blood. You're nothing but a gold digger who played the long game." Elias Thorne cleared his throat, a sound like a gavel. "Ms. King, I would choose your next words very carefully. I was present for every meeting between Solomon and Dahlia. She never once asked for a dime. In fact, she spent most of those meetings trying to convince Solomon that Marcus was capable of change. It was Solomon who insisted on the audit. It was Solomon who installed the cameras in the hallway of the apartment. He saw the eviction, Chloe. He saw it in real time." The color drained from Chloe's face. The realization hit them both at once. Solomon hadn't just been dying. He had been presiding over a trial. He had given Marcus one final test, how he would treat the woman who had loved him when he had nothing. And Marcus had failed before the dirt was even dry on the grave. The front door of the estate burst open, and 2 men in dark, nondescript suits walked in. They weren't guests. They weren't friends. They were the representatives from the bridge loan firm that had funded Marcus's week of excess. The lead man, a stone-faced individual with a briefcase, walked straight to Marcus. "Mr. King," he said, his voice loud enough for the remaining guests to hear, "we've just received a notification of a freeze on your expected assets. According to our contract, the moment your inheritance status became contested or conditional, the full balance of your bridge loans, $4.2 million, became due immediately." Marcus began to stutter, his hands flying to his throat as if he were choking. I need a few days. It's just a misunderstanding with the trustee. My wife." "I am not his wife for the purposes of his debts," I interrupted, looking the man in the eye. "And the trust will not be liquidating any assets to cover unauthorized personal loans taken out against a future that was never guaranteed. If you have a claim, you'll have to take it up with Mr. King's personal legal counsel." The man turned to Marcus, his expression hardening. "In that case, Mr. King, we are beginning the repossession process immediately. The Bentley is already being hitched to a tow truck in the driveway. The penthouse lease has been flagged for termination. I suggest you find a place to stay tonight." Marcus looked like he was going to vomit. He turned to me, his eyes brimming with tears, real tears this time, though they weren't for his father or for me. They were for himself. "Dahlia, please, you can't let them take everything. I'll have nothing. I'll be on the street. Is that what you want? After 10 years, you want to see me destroyed?" I walked closer to him until I could smell the expensive scotch on his breath and the desperation on his skin. "I don't want to see you destroyed, Marcus. I just want you to feel what I felt 6 days ago. I want you to understand the weight of being told you're worthless. You told me I was a placeholder? Well, it turns out you were right. You were just a placeholder for the woman Solomon actually wanted to run this company." I turned to Elias. "Mr. Thorne, Please begin the paperwork for the formal separation and the audit. I want a full accounting of every cent Marcus has spent from our joint accounts over the last decade. Anything that was taken under false pretenses will be added to the debt he owes the trust. As I walked toward the door, Marcus let out a primal, guttural scream of rage and grief. He lunged toward me, but the security guards Solomon had hired months ago, men I didn't even know were there, stepped out from the shadows of the foyer and intercepted him. They didn't hurt him, they just held him, a broken man in a $5,000 suit, as I walked out into the rain. The Bentley was indeed being loaded onto a flatbed. The British racing green paint looked dull under the gray sky. I stood on the porch of the King estate and took a deep breath. For 10 years, I had lived in the shadow of this family's greed, trying to be the light in a room that didn't want to be bright. Now, I was the one holding the keys to the house. I wasn't just Dahlia, the teacher's daughter. I was the woman who had survived the Kings. I called a taxi, a regular, unassuming yellow cab. As I waited for it to arrive, I pulled the iron key from my pocket and looked at it one last time. Solomon had called me the only true king. I realized now he didn't mean my last name. He meant my spirit. I got into the cab and told the driver to take me to the small office of the foundation where I worked. I had 10,000 words to write, 1,000,000 decisions to make, and an empire to rebuild from the ashes of a fool's ego. But first, I had to decide one thing. The audit would prove Marcus's fraud. It could send him to prison for years. As the cab pulled away from the gates, I looked back at the mansion. I held his life in my hands, and for the first time in my life, I wasn't sure if I was going to show him the mercy he never showed me. The first 48 hours after the will reading felt like the settling of dust after a massive explosion. I moved out of the motel, but I didn't go to the penthouse, and I didn't return to the apartment where I had been discarded. Instead, I stayed in a quiet, historic hotel downtown, a place that smelled of beeswax and old wood. I needed a sanctuary to process the sheer scale of the power Solomon had placed in my hands. My phone was a constant vibration of desperation. Marcus had called me 64 times. Chloe had sent dozens of texts, oscillating between vitriolic threats of lawsuits and pathetic pleas for family unity. I ignored them all. On the third morning, Elias Thorne requested a meeting at the estate. I drove myself this time in a modest car I had rented. I didn't want the drivers or the spectacle. As I pulled up to the gates, I saw a figure sitting on a stone bench outside the perimeter. It was Marcus. He was wearing the same suit from the funeral, but it was rumpled, stained, and he looked like he hadn't slept in days. He looked up as I drove past, his eyes hollow and rimmed with red. He didn't yell. He didn't move. He just watched me with the vacant stare of a man who had lost his soul along with his bank account. Inside the library, Elias was waiting with a stack of documents that looked like a mountain. "The preliminary audit is complete, Dahlia," he said, his voice grave. "It's worse than Solomon anticipated. Marcus didn't just forge signatures. He took out a secret mortgage on this very house while Solomon was in the hospital. He was planning to sell the estate to a commercial developer the moment the will was read. He had already signed a letter of intent." I felt a cold shiver. This house was Solomon's heart. To Marcus, it was just a piece of collateral to be traded for a faster car and a more expensive watch. "What does this mean for him legally?" I asked, looking out the window at the broken man by the gate. "It's wire fraud, Dahlia. It's identity theft. And because it involves the estate's trust, it's a federal matter," Elias explained, leaning back. "If you turn these documents over to the authorities, Marcus will be in a federal penitentiary before the month is out. There is no defense. The paper trail is a mile long and perfectly preserved by Solomon's private security." I looked at the documents. My signature was there too, or a version of it. Marcus had practiced my handwriting until he could mimic my consent on papers that gave him access to my small savings and my credit. He hadn't just betrayed his father. He had been systematically erasing me for years. I felt a surge of anger so sharp it made my vision blur. I wanted to see him in a cell. I wanted him to feel the walls closing in, just as I had felt them closing in when he slammed that door in my face. "But," Elias continued, pulling a smaller, velvet-lined box from his drawer, "Solomon left one final piece of the puzzle. He told me to give this to you only after you saw the full extent of the fraud. He called it The King's Choice. I opened the box. Inside was a flash drive and a small, faded photograph. I picked up the photo first. It was Solomon as a young man, standing in front of a small, dilapidated grocery store. Beside him was a woman I didn't recognize, his first wife, Marcus's mother, who had died when Marcus was a toddler. They looked happy, tired, and profoundly human. On the back, Solomon had written, "We started with nothing but a promise. Money didn't build this, Dahlia. Integrity did. If you lose the integrity, the money is just a pile of gold on a sinking ship." I plugged the flash drive into Elias's laptop. A new video appeared. This wasn't the stern, calculated Solomon from the vault. This was a man in his final hours, his voice barely a whisper, his eyes filmed over with the approaching end. "Dahlia," he whispered, "by now you know everything. You know the depths of my son's weakness, and you have the power to destroy him. But I want to tell you a story. When Marcus was 5, he broke a window in the store. He lied about it for a week. I knew he did it, but I waited. I wanted him to come to me. He never did. I realized then that I had failed to teach him the most important lesson, that a man is only as big as the mistakes he admits to. I spent the rest of my life trying to buy his character, and in doing so, I only made him small." Solomon took a ragged breath. "If you send him to prison, you are doing what the law requires. But if you give him the chance to confess, truly confess, without the threat of the hammer, you might save the man I couldn't. I am leaving the decision to you. You can release the audit to the FBI, or you can offer him a path to redemption. But remember, Dahlia, mercy given to those who aren't sorry is just a fresh coat of paint on a rotten wall. Make him prove he's a king." The video ended. I sat in the silence of the library, the weight of the choice pressing down on me. I thought about the 10 years of my life. I thought about the way he had laughed when he threw my purse into the hall. I thought about the worthless woman he thought I was. "Elias," I said, my voice barely audible, "bring him in. Bring Marcus into this room. Tell him he has 10 minutes. Alone." Elias nodded and stepped out. A few minutes later, Marcus entered. He looked even worse up close. He smelled of sweat and old rain. He didn't look at the desk. He kept his eyes on his shoes. He looked like a dog that expected to be kicked. "Dahlia," he began, his voice cracking, "I know you hate me. You have every right. I've lost everything. The lenders took the car, the penthouse is gone, even my clothes are in a locker at the bus station. I'm done. Just tell me what the lawyers want me to sign so I can go." "I don't want you to sign anything yet, Marcus," I said, sliding the audit documents across the desk. "I want you to read these. I want you to see exactly what I know. I want you to see the evidence of the fraud, the forgeries, and the theft. I want you to see the face of the man who sold his father's house while he was dying." He flipped through the pages, his hands shaking so much that the paper rattled. As he reached the section about the secret mortgage, he collapsed into a chair, burying his face in his hands. He began to sob, not the loud, performative crying of a man caught in a lie, but the quiet, shamed weeping of someone who finally sees the wreckage they've caused. "I was so scared," he choked out. "He never liked me, Dahlia. He always looked at me like I was a disappointment. I thought if I had the money, if I had the power, he'd finally see me. I thought I could fix everything once I had the 85 million. I just wanted to be big." "You were big, Marcus," I said. "You were big to me. I loved you when you were broke. I loved you when you were failing. You didn't need $85 million to be a king. You just needed to be a husband." I stood up and walked to the window. "Solomon left me a choice. I can call the federal prosecutor right now and you will go to prison for a long, long time. Or I can give you a different option, but it won't involve a Bentley and it won't involve a penthouse." Marcus looked up, a tiny spark of hope flickering in his dead eyes. "What? Anything, Dahlia. I'll do anything." "You will sign a full confession," I said, "not for the police, but for the trust. You will relinquish every claim to the king name and the inheritance. You will move into a small apartment the foundation owns, and you will work. Real work. Minimum wage. You will pay back every cent you stole from my savings, month by month, for the next 10 years. And if you miss a single payment, or if you ever speak to me or Chloe again without my permission, the audit goes to the FBI. You're letting me stay out of jail? He whispered. I'm giving you the chance to become a man of substance, Marcus, just like Solomon wanted. But you won't be a king, you'll just be a man, and you'll do it alone. He sat there for a long time, the silence in the library thick and heavy. Finally, he picked up a pen. His hand was still shaking, but as he signed the confession, something in his posture changed. The arrogance was gone, replaced by a grim, heavy reality. He finished the last page and pushed it toward me. "Thank you," he said, his voice a ghost of its former self. "Don't thank me," I replied. "Thank Solomon. He's the one who believed you were worth saving. I'm just the one who's making you prove it." As he walked out of the library, he looked smaller than ever, but for the first time in 10 years, he walked like a man who wasn't carrying a lie. I watched him leave the estate, walking down the long driveway toward the gate. He didn't look back. I turned back to Elias. "The audit stays in the safe, Elias, for now. But I want the paperwork for the foundation's expansion ready by Monday. We have $85 million to put to work, and I think it's time we started doing some real good with it." With Marcus neutralized and living in the shadows of the foundation's oversight, the mansion felt different. It was no longer a tomb of secrets, it was becoming a command center. I spent the next several days working side by side with Elias Thorne, diving deep into the complexities of the King Empire. I discovered that Solomon hadn't just been a real estate mogul, he had been a silent benefactor to dozens of struggling communities. He had built libraries, funded medical clinics, and provided scholarships to thousands, all under the radar. This was the legacy he had entrusted to me. This was the fire he wanted me to tend. But while I was focused on the light, the darkness hadn't fully retreated. Chloe King was still out there, and she wasn't a man like Marcus who could be broken by shame. Chloe was a woman who believed the world owed her a throne by birthright. She had disappeared for a few days after the audit reveal, but I knew she wasn't gone. She was a creature of the high society circuit, a woman who lived for optics and influence. She knew that if she couldn't win the legal battle, she would have to win the war of public opinion. On Thursday morning, I walked into the grand parlor of the estate to find Elias looking at a tablet with a grim expression. "She's started, Dahlia," he said, handing me the screen. A local news headline was already trending. "The King Dynasty hijacked. Insider claims Solomon's final days manipulated by golden digger wife." Below the headline was a video of Chloe sitting in a tastefully lit studio, her eyes artfully rimmed with tears, her voice a masterclass in calculated fragility. She spoke about how I had kept the family away from Solomon in his final hours, how I had whispered lies into his ear, and how I had coerced a dying, confused man into signing over his empire to me while Marcus was distraught with grief. She didn't mention the forgeries. She didn't mention the eviction. She painted herself and Marcus as the victims of a cold, calculating interloper who had used her position as a wife to commit the ultimate heist. "She's filing for a formal injunction to freeze the trust," Elias explained. "She's claiming Solomon was of unsound mind, incapable of making a legal will. If a judge grants the hearing, this could tie up the assets for years. The foundation's work will stop. The scholarships will freeze. Everything Solomon worked for will be held hostage by her ego." I felt the familiar heat of anger rising, but I forced it down. This was exactly what Solomon had warned me about, the flash trying to extinguish the substance. Chloe wanted a fight in the mud. She wanted me to go on television and defend myself, to trade insults and turn the King name into a tabloid joke. She thought I was the same woman who had stayed quiet at the wedding while she mocked my parents. "She thinks I'm going to play her game," I said, looking at the video of her crying on screen. "She thinks I'm going to file a countersuit and wait for a court date. But Chloe doesn't realize that Solomon didn't just give me the money. He gave me the keys to her world, too." I turned to Elias. "I want you to call a press conference. Not at a law office, not at the estate. I want it at the King Community Center in the South Side, the one Solomon built in secret 20 years ago. And I want you to invite every person Chloe King considers a friend. Invite the developers, the socialites, the board members of the opera and the museum. Tell them the new trustee of the King estate has an announcement that will affect the city's entire social and philanthropic landscape." "What are you planning, Dahlia?" Elias asked, a small, knowing smile playing on his lips. "Chloe loves being at the top of the social ladder," I said. "But she forgets that the ladder is built on the King name. It's time I reminded her who owns the ladder." The press conference was set for Friday evening. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the community center was flooded with the kind of people who usually wouldn't be caught dead in that part of town. They came out of curiosity, their luxury SUVs lining the cracked pavement of the neighborhood. Chloe was there too, sitting in the front row with her high-priced legal team, her face a mask of smug anticipation. She thought she had me cornered. She thought I was going to beg for a settlement. I walked onto the small, modest stage. I wasn't wearing the black funeral dress anymore. I was wearing a sharp, tailored navy suit, the color of authority and calm. I didn't look at the cameras. I looked at the people in the room, the families who lived in the neighborhood, the children who used the center's library, and the high society elite who were looking around with visible discomfort. "Good evening," I began, my voice amplified by the simple sound system. "For the past week, many of you have heard stories about the King family. You've heard about $85 million. You've heard about wills, trusts, and interlopers. But tonight, I want to talk about the reality of Solomon King's legacy." I gestured to a large screen behind me. Instead of legal documents, it showed photos of the community center, the clinics, and the names of the students who had graduated college because of Solomon's secret grants. "Solomon King knew that money without purpose is just a burden," I continued, "and he knew that his children had lost sight of that purpose. Chloe King has claimed that I manipulated a dying man. She has claimed that the King fortune belongs to her by blood." I turned my gaze directly to Chloe. She didn't flinch. She leaned back, a small, mocking smile on her face. "So tonight I am making a decision as the sole trustee of the King estate," I announced. "Effective immediately, the King Trust is being restructured into a permanent endowment. The $85 million will never be distributed to individuals. It will be used exclusively to fund the King Foundation's work in this city forever." A gasp went through the room. Chloe's smile vanished. She sat bolt upright, her eyes wide with shock. "Furthermore," I said, my voice rising, "Solomon left a specific provision regarding the family's social standing. He believed that the King name should only be associated with those who contribute to the city. Therefore, the Trust is withdrawing all financial support from the boards and organizations that have allowed the King name to be used for vanity. We are pulling our funding from the opera, the country club, and the museum's gala. Those funds are being redirected here, to this neighborhood." The socialites in the room began to murmur in horror. They weren't just losing a donor, they were losing the prestige of the King name. "And as for Chloe King," I said, the room falling silent, "Solomon's will stated that her inheritance, the $5 million, was contingent on her completing a financial management course and serving a year of community service. Since she has chosen to spend her time attacking the estate and the integrity of her father's wishes, the Trust is moving to have her inheritance permanently forfeited for breach of the morality clause. She won't just lose the money, Chloe, she'll lose the status. From tonight, you are no longer a representative of the King legacy. You are just a private citizen with a very expensive, very empty lifestyle." Chloe stood up, her face distorted with rage. "You can't do this. I'll sue you into the ground. You're stealing my life." "I'm not stealing it, Chloe," I said, looking down at her from the stage. "I'm just making you live the life you've earned. You told me 6 days ago that I didn't belong in your world. You were right. Because in my world, we don't value people by what they inherit. We value them by what they give. And you have given nothing." The security guards moved in as Chloe began to scream, her poise shattering into 1,000 pieces of ugly, raw desperation. The cameras caught every second of it. The Golden Digger narrative died in that moment. The public didn't see a victimized daughter. They saw a spoiled, entitled woman throwing a tantrum in a neighborhood she had spent her life ignoring. As the crowd dispersed and the friends Chloe had relied on began to distance themselves from her as if she were contagious, I stood on the stage with Elias. "You didn't just beat her, Dahlia," Elias whispered. "You erased her." "I didn't erase her, Elias. I said, watching the taillights of the luxury cars fade into the distance. I just turned the lights on. Now she has to deal with the shadows. I walked out of the community center and into the night air. The empire was secure, the foundation was funded, and for the first time in 35 years, I knew exactly who I was. But there was one final thing Solomon had hinted at in his letters, a secret that wasn't about money or houses, it was about my own family. A secret that would change everything I thought I knew about why Solomon King had chosen me in the first place. The fallout from the press conference was swift and absolute. Within 24 hours, the name Chloe King had been scrubbed from every board of directors and every guest list in the city. Without the King Trust's checkbook to back her up, she was no longer a socialite, she was a liability. I heard through Elias that she had moved into a small rental, her designer bags sold to pay for the legal fees of a lawsuit that was already dead in the water. Marcus was gone too, absorbed into the quiet, grueling anonymity of the Foundation's work program, a man finally learning the weight of a dollar. The storm had passed, leaving me standing in the center of an $85 million legacy. But there was one final shadow in the corner of the King estate. Solomon's personal safe in his study. Not the vault in the basement, but a small, hidden compartment behind a painting of the Georgia coast, remained unopened. The iron key had opened the vault, but Solomon's final letter had mentioned a gift of truth that could only be found once the house was quiet. On my final night before officially moving the Foundation's headquarters into the mansion, I sat in Solomon's leather chair, the scent of old books and silver polish wrapping around me like a shroud. I pressed the hidden latch, and the compartment clicked open. Inside was a single, weathered, leather-bound journal and a yellowed birth certificate from a small town in North Georgia, dated 35 years ago. I opened the journal to the last entry, written in Solomon's shaky, elegant hand, just days before his heart finally slowed to a stop. "Dahlia," the entry began, "they will tell you I chose you because of your integrity. They will tell you I chose you because my children were a disappointment. And all of that is true. But there is a deeper truth I have carried like a stone in my chest since the day Marcus brought you home to meet me. Do you remember when I asked you about your parents? You told me they were teachers, humble people who raised you in the shadow of the mountains. You told me your mother, Rose, had passed away when you were just a girl." My heart began to race. I remembered that conversation. Solomon had become uncharacteristically quiet when I mentioned my mother's name. He had looked at me with an intensity that I had mistaken for the wandering mind of an old man. "Rose wasn't just a teacher to me, Dahlia," the journal continued. 36 years ago, before I became the King of Atlanta, I was a man lost in the hills, trying to build a business from nothing. I met Rose in a small town called Dahlonega. She was the light of my life, the only woman who ever saw the man I was before the money arrived. We were young, and I was ambitious, too ambitious. I left her to pursue the empire, thinking I would come back for her once I had proven myself. But by the time I returned, she was gone, married to a kind man who gave her the life I was too selfish to provide. I stared at the birth certificate. The name on the mother's line was Rose Evans. The father's line was blank. But stapled to the back was a DNA test result, conducted privately by Solomon months before I ever married Marcus. The probability of paternity was 99.9%. The room seemed to tilt on its axis. I wasn't just the teacher's daughter. I wasn't just the wife Marcus had discarded. I was Solomon's daughter. I was a king by blood, a secret he had kept even from me to ensure that if I ever rose to power, it would be because of my character, not my name. He had watched Marcus bring me home, horrified by the irony but moved by the providence of it. He had spent the last 10 years watching his biological daughter care for his legal son, waiting for the moment I would prove myself worthy of the throne I was born to inherit. "I didn't let Marcus marry you to be cruel," the writing went on. "I let it happen because I hoped your light would save him. I hoped that having a woman of your substance by his side would fix the rot I had allowed to grow in him. But when I saw how he treated you, when I saw him try to break the very spirit that reminded me of Rose, I knew the empire had to go to the rightful heir. You aren't an interloper, Dahlia. You are the return of the light I threw away 36 years ago. The 85 million isn't a gift from a father-in-law. It is an apology from a father." I let the journal fall into my lap, tears streaming down my face. All those years of feeling like an outsider, of feeling like I had to earn my place at the table, and I had been the owner of the table all along. Solomon hadn't just saved me from Marcus, he had brought me home. He had given me the resources to do the work Rose would have been proud of. The next morning, I stood on the front porch as the sun rose over the Atlanta skyline. I had a new name for the foundation, the Rose and Solomon King Legacy. I wasn't going to live in the mansion. I turned it into a residence for single mothers and a school for the arts, a place where worthless women could find their worth. I kept a small office in the back, the one with the view of the garden Solomon loved. I received one final letter that afternoon. It was from the work camp where Marcus was stationed. There was no money requested, no threats, and no pleas for a second chance. It was just a small, hand-drawn map of the garden we used to sit in, and a single sentence written on the back. I finally understand what you meant about the North Star. I'm sorry I was too blind to follow it. I put the note in the journal and closed it. I didn't hate Marcus anymore. I didn't need to. He was a man finding his way, and I was a woman who had finally found hers. I walked down the steps of the estate, the iron key now a permanent fixture on my keychain, a reminder that some doors are opened with metal, but the most important ones are opened with the heart. I am Dahlia. I am 35 years old. I was once thrown out of my home by a man who thought I was nothing. Today, I am the woman who redefined what it means to be a king. And the best part of the story? The official reading was only the beginning. The real work, the work of substance, the work of Rose, is just getting started. Thank you for watching my journey from the shadows to the light. If you've ever been underestimated, remember, the person who throws you out might just be clearing the path for you to walk back in as the owner.